The Southern strategy of the well-funded, nationally coordinated ultra-right believes and has convinced many who purport a narrow and extreme political agenda that the only way they can hold on to their political power in the nation at the national level, the state level, and the local level is to drastically suppress voting rights for minorities, African Americans, Latino women, and others. Because of this, we need every resource of the civil rights community and the U.S. government to help us expose the national conspiracy behind this movement to suppress targeted constituencies, particularly in the new Southern electorate. As the good people of North Carolina and throughout the country learn about the origins and the true aims of this hodgepodge of voter suppression tactics, we are confident that they, the good people of the state, and the courts will join us, the NAACP, and many partners in our Moral Monday Forward Together community in saying forward together, not one step back. We have sensed a strong new multiracial progressive movement growing in the state. The good people of North Carolina are disgusted when they learn that the far right created the myth of voter fraud, financed it, and repeated it over and over, intentionally creating the main pretext for this naked power grab through voter suppression by extremists. Filed in August, only an hour after the governor signed, less than an hour after the governor signed the voter suppression bill, our lawsuit seeks to protect and preserve the voting rights of North Carolina citizens. Rights, as our suit says, imperiled by the passage of new legislation that imposes unjustified and discriminatory electoral burdens on large segments of the state's population and will cause the denial, dilution, and abridgment of African Americans' fundamental right to vote. It charges that the law violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which bans voter procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or membership in one of the language minority groups. The suit also challenges the law under the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. We should be reminded of what Representative Mickey Mashaw tried to put before this General Assembly before this bill was ever passed. And then he summed it up afterwards and said, this bill is not about voter ID requirements. And it is important for the media to grab it. This is not just about voter ID. This is about voter suppression. This is about fundamentally rewriting and restructuring voting rights and access to voting for citizens across this state. Mickey Mashaw said it is 57 pages of regressive, unconstitutional acts to rig and manipulate elections through voter suppression. Our lawsuit will show how this voter suppression bill, in its many eerie elements, revisits the tactics of Jim Crow in the 21st century and are a form of what we have called James Crow Esquire tactics, because each suppression tactic that has been laid out in this new bill has a disproportionate, disparate, and discriminatory impact, especially on African Americans and other minorities. This act of the legislature and the governor is about race, an outright attempt to manipulate voting and the result of voting through suppressing the African American vote and the votes of others that expand the electorate in ways that are often not favorable to the support of a narrow and extreme political agenda. It's not about voter fraud. There's never been any evidence of that. That was the distortion, the fraud that set up passing this manipulative bill. Governor Pat McCrory and the North Carolina legislature are on the wrong side of history. This bill is against democracy and our most sacred constitutional values. This anti-voting rights bill tramples on the blood of the martyrs, desecrates the graves of freedom fighters, and in the 21st century lines up with the extreme racially driven philosophy of interposition and nullification, where leaders in the state attempt to undermine the rights afforded to citizens through the federal Constitution. This voter suppression bill is a direct attempt to suppress voting rights in North Carolina and to secure power through manipulation of the electorate. And when you do that, that is the ultimate crime against democracy, and it is being driven by extremists in our state. This atrocious voter suppression bill the governor signed, which represents the worst of everything, the worst voting rights attack in the nation, combined in one piece of legislation, seeks to end same-day registration, limit early voting, unleashes vigilante poll watch observers, undoes public financing, disallows 16 and 17-year-olds the ability to pre-register, and mandates a 21st century poll tax in the name of voter ID that is more restrictive than South Carolina and Alabama. This is a fight about how our democracy works. This is not some mere discussion about voter ID. North Carolina has the best election law in the country. Signature attestation. It was a compromise between Republicans and Democrats. You sign your name, and if you lied, you have got a 5-year felony. In the last few years, we passed the best and most progressive voting laws, same-day registration, early voting, and Sunday voting. And North Carolina was leading the United States in voter participation throughout this country. We need more access to the ballot, not less. This is a fight about how our democracy works, and can elected officials use their power to commit crimes against democracy and undermine access to citizens. Elected leaders are supposed to work for the good of the whole. They swear to that. They put their hands on a Bible. It's been in our Constitution since 1868. They are supposed to uphold the Constitution, and they are supposed to be stewards of the democracy, not destroyers of the democracy. As Attorney General Holder said, when they limit, speaking about any elected official, when they limit our access to the ballot, he said, we cannot and we will not stand by. This bill shows that extremists in the North Carolina General Assembly joined with the governor, and I want to be clear about these words, had a premeditated desire. This is not accidental. A premeditated desire to suppress the vote and to manipulate elections for their own narrow political purposes. This is not how our democracy should work. We want all people, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, young, old, white, black, Latino, whoever you are in North Carolina, we are fighting for the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law, and all people having the opportunity to participate in this democracy. As the United States Attorney General said again, not only can we prove that the impact is discriminatory, we can also show that the intent was to make it that way. And so because of this, I stand here today with Attorney Jamie Phillips, Attorney Stein, Attorney Al McShirley, in absentia, Attorney Pender Hare, and all of the lawyers at Advancement Project and others, and also Attorney Irv Joyner and the others, representatives of the North Carolina NAACP and our great coalition of more than 160 partners to the HK-on-J Coalition and the Forward Together movement and the Tomorrow Monday movement, we are pleased today, because of all that we have said, that the Attorney General, Eric Holder, has announced that the U.S. attorneys from the 3 North Carolina federal districts will join our fight and will file a lawsuit asking the federal courts to block the recently passed voter law, a law many voting rights experts have called the worst voter suppression law in the nation. And they will use the provisions under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and Section 3, which allows bail-in, to fight for our democracy, to be a democracy of the people, by the people, and for the people, and to never be the victim of those who would dare manipulate their power or misuse their power in order to undermine our democracy rather than to be good stewards of our democracy.
I am privileged to be one of the lawyers representing the NAACP in this very important litigation. I think what happened today, the announcement by the Attorney General, is significant and entirely appropriate. What the North Carolina General Assembly did was to violate extremely important federal law, the Voting Rights Act and the 14th and 15th Amendment, and therefore it is a time when the federal government should come in the name of the Attorney General to make sure that those federal rights are observed, and that the statute that was passed that infringes on those rights is put aside. So we welcome Attorney General Holder and the 3 U.S. attorneys in North Carolina in this fight. We think their participation is important, both symbolically and in terms of the resources they can bring to bear. I would add to what Reverend Barber said. North Carolina has moved from, in 1988, we were the 48th state in voting. Had 45% of the registered voters voting, and in the last election in 2012, we were up to 65%, and we were 11th. We'd moved from 48 to 11. This bill will, if it takes effect, will move us back to where we don't want to go to again.
Well, I do want to say that Democracy North Carolina joins the NAACP in applauding the Justice Department for intervening and we hope that there is a vigorous challenge from the DOJ to a law that is designed to push away voters, and it's a rigging of the election system to benefit incumbent politicians. North Carolina has a sad history of voter suppression stemming from the Jim Crow laws adopted by the Democrats over 100 years ago that included the poll tax, the literacy test, and other measures pushing away African Americans and low-income white voters. As a result of those laws and intimidating practices, North Carolina ranked in the bottom 12 states throughout the entire 20th century for voter participation, in the bottom 12 states throughout the entire 20th century, including the ranking of 48th in 1988. Since 2000, voter participation has begun to rise again, as thanks to early voting, thanks to same-day registration, thanks to out-of-precinct voting. In 2008, North Carolina led the nation in gains from 2008 to 2004. And in 2012, indeed, we were ranked 11th in the top 12 states for voter turnout, a historic high. Republican lawmakers had clear evidence that the proposals that they would adopt would harm African American voters. There is clear intentionality in what they did. Yet they did it anyway. They had no evidence of fraud, no real evidence of fraud caused by voter impersonation or out-of-precinct voting, yet they imposed new restrictions anyway. In fact, they had more evidence of fraud caused by mail-in absentee voting, a method that's used by more Republicans than Democrats. And in fact, this same law, H. 587, makes access to absentee ballots easier through mass mailings and other techniques. So they increased access to a method that they know has a higher rate of fraud than in-person voting. Absolutely absurd. African Americans, now here's the data that backs up all of this. African Americans are 22% of registered voters in 2012, but they cast only 9% of the mail-in absentee ballots in the General Assembly that the Republicans want to make more accessible. Meanwhile, they are cast 29% of all the in-person early ballots. They're 22% of the registered voters. They cast 29% of the early ballots, 34% of the same-day registration ballots for new voters, 45% of the ballots by voters using same-day registration to update their registration, 30% of the out-of-precinct ballots cast on Election Day, and 43% of the ballots cast on the now eliminated first Sunday of early voting. That's what they did. In March of 2013, when African Americans had become 23% of the registered voters, an analysis by the State Board of Elections showed that 318,000 registered voters did not appear to have a DMV photo identification, and 34% of them were African Americans. Nevertheless, Republican lawmakers adopted the strictest photo ID requirement in the nation. The strictest in the nation. Not for mail-in, but for in-person voters. They refused to accept student IDs from public colleges or accept affidavit ballots from a voter who lacks an ID, as do the other states that have a photo ID requirement. Most North Carolinians do in fact say, yes, a photo ID is a common sense requirement. But the polls also show that 70%, a supermajority of North Carolina voters, think that a voter without an ID should not be forced to come back. They should be allowed to vote an affidavit ballot swearing they are who they are, give a birth date or an ID number that can be verified. The data makes it very clear. The voter suppression measures passed by this Republican leadership must be challenged, and we welcome the Justice Department's intervention.
Let me just reiterate a couple of things and beg of my friends in the media, because you have this great task before you to teach the public and to be objective. We never want you to have our side or the other side. What we want to do is present what the Constitution says. And if we're on the side of the Constitution, then you report, quote, on our side. Be careful not to get caught up in that this is about voter ID. Again, we already had the best law, signatory attestation. And these silly arguments that, well, if you have to use an ID to get Sudafed, that take you into, it's like chasing a rabbit. We're talking about constitutional rights. We're talking about someone attempting to put something on the burden on people that is unnecessary, unconstitutional, and really immoral, to try to block people's right to vote. In addition, this law fundamentally changes so many areas, so many other areas, and the public needs to know that, and we want to thank you all for reporting on all of those other areas that this legislation is attempting to use in order to narrow the electorate, because those with a narrow-minded agenda cannot afford to have a broad electorate. They know that when the people vote, they do not tend to support narrow-minded agendas. And so we should be extraordinarily concerned, and particularly in the South, all of the blood that was shed for us to have the right to vote, all of the marching that was done and the praying that was done and people coming together. And that's why in our movement, in Forward Together, the Tomorrow Monday movement, you have seen such a broad representation of North Carolinians, black and white and young and old, all Latino, all coming together, because we know that these kind of manipulative efforts are fundamentally wrong. And that's why in the NAACP, in our history, we've challenged extremists in any party. Doesn't matter what party they're in. When it was Dixie Democrats, we challenged them. We challenged them and fought them when they attempted to undermine the principles of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and our own state constitution. And we'll challenge Republicans when they're extremists in their party. And when there are Republicans who will support the Constitution, we'll support them, just as we supported the many Republicans who voted for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, or Republicans who stood with us, the Lincoln Republicans who stood with us during the days of right after the Civil War and even before. And so this is not so much about party as it is about the principles, the deep underlying principles of our Constitution. We should all be ashamed of what this legislature has done in our name. We should be taken aback that people would use a lie like voter fraud in order to manipulate the public to support a law that is diametrically opposed to our constitutional values. But we should do something more than be ashamed. We should step into the fight. And that's why we are pleased to see the Attorney General say, we must bring to bear every resource that would do anything to undermine people's right to vote. Because once you destroy and undermine the right to vote, even if it's a little bit, then you're opening the door for this not to be a democracy of the people, but an empire ruled by the few. That is not the America we dream of. That is not the America we love. And that's why we fight.